Hello, my name is Todd Bennett, and I'd like to welcome you to this latest episode of the Leaving Babylon series. In the past episodes, we've talked about the fact that the gospel involved the Messiah coming and fulfilling the covenant. And that covenant was patterned around the life of the man named Abram, who was later renamed Abraham. Now, as we consider the notion of leaving Babylon, we also have to consider not only where we're departing from, but also our destination. If we're leaving Babylon, where are we going? When Abram was told to leave Babylon, he had a destination, and that destination was the land of Canaan. And if we're to follow the pattern of Abram, then we too should be interested in the covenant land. And of course, this is another issue where Christianity disconnects from the true scriptural faith, because most Christians are really not concerned about the covenant land. They've detached themselves from that land covenant. They think, oh, that's just for the Jewish people. And they fail to understand that, no, this is the land of the covenant. And if you're part of the seed of Abraham, if you're in this covenant involving the Messiah, then you should be very interested in the covenant land, which was originally known as Canaan, because that's where the Messiah is going to establish his kingdom. And of course, that's where Elohim set up his house. Sadly, Christianity really has no definitive destination except for the fact they think they're going to get saved and go to heaven. And they believe that if someone dies, they go straight to heaven, but that's just not supported by the scriptures, as we've already talked about. While that may make grieving individuals feel better at funeral services, it simply is not accurate. When a person dies, they go to Sheol until the resurrection. Sheol is the Hebrew word generally described as the grave. And after the resurrection, the goal is to enter the kingdom that the Messiah establishes here on earth. And while the scriptures talk about regathering the elect and them meeting Yeshua in the clouds, our final destination is not in the clouds. Our inheritance is the kingdom that the Messiah will establish here on this earth. And when in covenant with the king, we're connected to a spiritual kingdom that is being expanded onto this planet through the Messiah and those who are in covenant with Yah. Now that's why Adam was made from the dust of the earth. He was provided land and told to be fruitful and to multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And we read about that in Genesis 1:28. This was the kingdom mandate from the very beginning. Adam was made from the dust, and he was intimately connected with this earth. Now, the relationship between man and Elohim was severed due to man's disobedience, and we've talked about that. And the plans for the kingdom were delayed as a result of that disobedience. We previously talked about how the relationship with Yahweh and man is being restored through the progressive covenant relationship pattern through the life of Abraham and his descendants on through to the Messiah. So before he was called Abraham, we first read the promise to Abram in Genesis 13:14 through 17. It says, "And Yahweh said to Abraham, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in a land through its length and its width, for I give it to you." So we see that Abram was promised land and numerous descendants who are compared to the dust of the earth. Later with Yaakov, we read a similar promise in Genesis 28, beginning at 13 through 15. It says, "And behold, Yahweh stood above it and said, I am the Elohim of Abraham, your father, and the Elohim of Yitzhak. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your descendants. Also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. and you shall spread abroad to the west and the east, to the north and the south. And in you and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have spoken to you. Now again, notice how the covenant people are likened to dust, combined with the covenant land and the promise of the land. And this brings us right back to the beginning. It's a renewal and a reset, and it reveals how Yahweh operates in cycles and in patterns. And remember that the word Adam is connected to the word for ground, Adamah. Adam was taken from the dust of the earth and given land to care for, as we already said. He failed and was expelled and punished along with the Nachash, the serpent. And punishments were given. And to the serpent, we read in Genesis 3:14, so Yahweh Elohim said to the serpent, the Nachash, because you have done this, you are cursed more than all cattle and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the days of your life. Notice that reference to dust. And to the man was said in Genesis 3:19, in the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken. From dust you are, and from dust you shall return. So the punishments in the garden included dust, and while man was intended to live forever, now he would return to the dust, to Sheol. So we see the cycle of a man's existence from the beginning. And this would set in motion the cycles necessary to restore man to his Creator. These cycles are rehearsed through the annual cycles of the appointed times, which will be discussed in a future episode. They're also patterned through the covenant cycles lived out by Abram as he went through the transformation to become the new man, Abraham. This is all very consistent with Eastern thought and action, which is cyclical in nature. And of course, the Eastern culture is one of covenants, while Western culture is more about contracts. As we talked about in the last episode, contracts are typically focused on business or economics, while covenants go to deeper relationships that often deal with life and death issues. We're talking about different cultures with different ways of dealing with people and different ways of looking at the world. And while Eastern thinking is very circular, Western thinking is very linear. And while Eastern covenants are typically progressive through time until the death of a party or even beyond, a typical Western contract must have a definitive term, a beginning and an end. And a covenant is a very Eastern thing, and the best example is a marriage covenant where a relationship should strengthen and deepen with the passage of time. It's not static, and it shouldn't have any limitation on time. Sadly, many in Western cultures look at a marriage as some sort of just an economic contract or an economic partnership that continues until either the love is gone or the partnership dissolves in some form. And these are very different ways of looking at relationships that impact the way we perceive our existence. So our culture and thinking affect the way we look at the world around us and our relationships. Another example can be seen in these covenant promises that we just cited above, where the descendants would be like dust. Those passages also provided directions for the expansion of the land promise. They both referred to the north and the south and the east and the west. And in Genesis 13:14-15 we read, and Yahweh said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever. And then again, the other promise we read in Genesis 28:14, also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and the south. And in you and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, as Western thinkers, our first instinct is to think of a compass with the four cardinal directions, with specific lines and degrees. And these are very artificial and abstract concepts which typify the Western thought and perspective. An Eastern thinker doesn't have these, a compass in mind and doesn't think of lines and arrows and all that Westerners think of. Easterners actually view directions in a very concrete fashion, which is actually reflected in the Hebrew language. In Hebrew, the word we translate as north is Zaphon, and Zaphon derives from Mount Zaphon in the northern edge of Syria. The word for south is called Negev, and of course, we know that the Negev desert is southward in the covenant land. The word for east is named Kedem, linked with the color red, the rising of the sun, or at dawn, or the red sandstone cliffs of the land of Edom to the east. The word for west is called Yam, meaning sea. As mentioned in Numbers 34:6, we read, "As for the western, which is Yam, border, you shall have the great sea, Yam, for a border. This shall be your western Yam border." So we see it's just the word for west is Yam. It's the same as sea, and of course that's reflected by the fact that the sea is to the west of the covenant land. So directions in the scriptures and the Eastern mindset are linked with real geographical places, not simply abstract points on a compass. And this is a very important distinction and really highlights the difference between Eastern and Western thought. And it's important to understand that the fathers of the covenant, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, they weren't Jews. Abram was called a Hebrew. In Genesis 14:13, we read, "Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, the Amorite." So Abram, later called Abraham, was called a Hebrew, and all his descendants were also Hebrews. They weren't Jewish, they were Hebrews. This is an important distinction because the word Jew derives from the name Judah that was given by Leah to her child. And we read about that account in Genesis 29:35 when Leah said, "Now I will praise Yahweh." Uda et Yahweh is what we read in the Hebrew, and the root Yada et Yahweh, to know et Yahweh, is what it actually reads if we take a mechanical translation of that text in Hebrew. And so that's how she got the name Yahudah. Basically, it's the name of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh with a dalet in there. And it's literally the name of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, again, with that dalet, the door, inserted there. So it's a very prophetic picture that's given that through the door of Yehudah, Judah, would come the Messiah. And he would be the door to Yahweh. So in the Hebrew, the word that we call Jew comes from Judah, and it refers to either one of the 12 tribes, the individual Judah, or the southern kingdom of Judah. And it's not inclusive of all the tribes of Israel, nor does it include even the patriarchs of the covenant, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we use this blanket word Jew for Jewish roots and all that, but it's really not a good descriptive word. We should be looking at the word Hebrew. None of the patriarchs were Jewish, and none of them followed the religion of Rabbinic Judaism. They were Hebrews, not Jews, and that's why we're not talking about being Jewish or Jewish roots in this series about leaving Babylon. We're talking about going back to our Hebrew roots. Jewish roots either means going back to the start of the Jewish religion after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, or Jewish roots could refer to the start of the southern kingdom under Rehoboam after the death of Solomon, when the kingdom of Judah actually began. Or Jewish roots could mean the time when David began his reign over Judah before he united the entire kingdom. Or it could refer to going back to the birth of the man named Judah. But that's as far back as you're going to go if you're going to examine Jewish roots. But we want to get back to the covenant that was established before Judah was even born. And in order to do that, we have to look at our Hebrew roots. So everything before that is Hebrew roots when we're examining the covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who all thought, acted, and lived as Easterners. And the scriptures were written in an Eastern language by Easterners, describing a journey of Easterners as they walked out an Eastern covenant with a Creator who comes out of the East, which we'll examine in a bit. So this idea of Hebrew roots involves getting back to our Eastern heritage, our Eastern culture, our Eastern perspective on life and our existence. The word Hebrew is actually Eberi in the Hebrew language, Ayin Bet Resh Yud, and it derives from Eber, who was a man. And the question is, why Abram was identified with Eber, when his father was actually Terah? And the reason is actually found in the scriptures. And we read in Genesis 10:25, to Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Okay, so this is important. We touched upon it earlier. The nations were divided during the days of Peleg, and Peleg's father was Eber. So his line stayed connected with the patriarchal line of Eber, and while the languages were divided, we talked about what happened at Babel in a previous episode, the languages were divided and the people were scattered. Peleg and his line retained the Hebrew language and belief in Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. And Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh actually they were his inheritance. So the righteous line continued even after the division and separation and confusion of languages. And we know that the generation passed from Eber, Peleg, Ragua, Saruk, Nahor, Terah, to Abram. Okay, so Abram traces back to Eber, and that's the righteous line continued even though the nations were divided and the languages were confused. They were all Hebrews through to Abraham and beyond. So this is what his descendants were called in Egypt, as a matter of fact, even after Jacob was renamed Yisrael. And we read about that in Exodus 3:18. It says, then they will heed your voice, and you shall come, you and the elders of Yisrael, to the king of Egypt. And you shall say to him, Yahweh Elohim of the Hebrews has met with us, and now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to Yahweh our Elohim. So Yahweh is repeatedly identified as the Elohim of the Hebrews, those who derive from Eber. We read about that in Exodus 9:13 and 10:3. And of course, this makes perfect sense when we recall that Yahweh divided the nations, again, during the life of Peleg. And remember, in Deuteronomy 32:7-8, it says, remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you, when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Elohim. So Yahweh set sons of Elohim over the nations, and he chose the descendants of Eber, the Eberi, the Hebrews. Now, as we left off in the last teaching, in order to properly walk out this covenant path, it's important to learn how to think and live like a Hebrew. The Hebrew mindset, as we've said, derives from an Eastern culture, and it's well understood in scholarly circles that there are powerful differences between Eastern and Western thought. In fact, a letter from Paul aptly describes this difference as we read in 1 Corinthians 1:22. He says, for Jews request a sign, and Greeks seek after wisdom. The Jews were the Eastern thinkers who originated from the Hebrews, and the Greeks were the Gentiles. They were the Hellenized ones, the Western thinkers. So that really does aptly describe the Eastern thinkers seek a sign, and the Western thinkers seek after wisdom. And Easterners look for signs because Eastern thought is considered to be concrete. They're looking for something real and tangible. The Hellenized Westerners, they sought out wisdom. Their thought is considered to be abstract. They seek wisdom and knowledge. And that's why Gnosticism flourished as the Greeks Hellenized the world and influenced Jewish thought, Hebrew thought, and later Christian communities. Now, it's important to recognize that as Hebrews, We cannot be consumed with signs. Recall the words of Yeshua in Luke 11:29. It says, "This is an evil generation. It seeks a sign, and no sign will be given to it except for the sign of Jonah the prophet. For as Jonah became a sign to the Ninevites, so also the Son of Man will be to this generation." So here the Yahudim, they had the Messiah walking and teaching amongst them, and they still sought out a sign. But he didn't say he wouldn't give them a sign, but he said, "I'm only going to give them one sign." So, but signs are important, and we read about that in Genesis 1:14, which specifically states, "Then Elohim said, 'Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and moedim, and for days and for years.'" So clearly, we're to be looking to the heavenly lights for their intended signs. They help us tell time and properly keep the moedim, which are the appointed times. The appointed times are weekly, monthly, and yearly times established by the Creator that every Hebrew should be observing. And at the beginning of the series, we talked about the weekly Shabbat. In future episodes, we'll be talking about the annual appointed times. All these cycles keep us focused on the Creator and are an important part of being Hebrew. In fact, they instill that Eastern mindset, that repetition, the cyclical way of looking at time and our walk. It works in cycles, the weekly cycle of the Shabbat and the annual cycle of the appointed times. So as we already mentioned, Western thought is considered to be linear. Again, Eastern is cyclical and circular, and observing time in a cyclical fashion is very Eastern and involves the observations of the sun and the moon. Westerners, on the other hand, typically count days and months on a fixed calendar and perceive time from infinity past through to the year zero onward to infinity future. And this difference is not limited to time, though. As we already examined the difference in how directions are perceived, the thought differences permeate actually all areas of life. And of course, a culture's way of thinking naturally gets transmitted into the spoken and eventually the written language. We can actually see a stark example of how opposite Eastern and Western languages are simply by the way they're written. Many Eastern languages are actually written from right to left, while many Western languages are written from left to right. And many Eastern languages actually derive from pictographs or hieroglyphics, where the characters are a visual representation of something concrete, where the character was understood to have a meaning, and when combined together they formed related meanings and concepts. And most Western languages simply have letters that when combined together form words. And when you understand the meaning of characters in the Eastern languages, you can develop an understanding of the language much easier than in Western languages. And in those Western languages, you have to simply memorize the characters and the combination of characters that form words. And the characters and their combinations don't necessarily have any relationship to the meaning of the words. So that's another distinct difference. And these are just some generalities to try to make the point clear and to demonstrate some of the differences in the way Westerners and Easterners think and act and write and speak. And just as many of the Western cultures that make up Babylon are directly opposed to Yahweh, even their languages and the way that they think and act are opposite from the Hebrew languages. So as we journey out of Babylon, we need to adjust the way that we think and perceive the world. And this is not always an easy thing to grasp. We don't often examine the way we think, nor do we typically consider the notion that we think differently from other people, but it's true. And if you were born in Babylon, I can pretty much assure you that you don't think the same way that an ancient Hebrew thought, and you don't look at life the same way that they did. Now remember that the scriptures were written mostly by ancient Hebrews about ancient Hebrews living in an ancient Hebrew culture following an ancient Hebrew covenant, as we mentioned before. So you gotta understand this, or you're going to misapply scriptures, as is often done. We see in a lot of Christian circles how certain verses will just be cherry-picked to try to prove something that somebody wants to create as a doctrine. And that becomes very dangerous. And sometimes you have to understand the scriptures are not always literal, and that's a very Hebrew thing when it comes to Hebrew literature and speech. The Hebrew scriptures need to be read and understood in their own context, culture, and in their own language. And the authors, again, were not always literal with things. They employed what's called conceptual metaphors. And a conceptual metaphor refers to the way we use a concrete term or idea to communicate abstract ideas. For instance, in Psalm 18:2 we read, Yahweh is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my Elohim, my strength, in whom I will trust, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. So Yahweh is not an actual rock, but the idea is to relate the fact that Elohim is a solid, reliable, strong, and powerful Elohim. Yahweh is not an actual fortress or tower, but he protects his people. And he's not a literal shield, but he protects us like a shield. And he's not a horn, which is keren, and that word represents the horn of an altar. But we cling to him, and he saves us from death, as if someone who went and sought refuge and took hold of one of the horns of the altar. Of course, this is what John the Baptist's father stated when he was filled with the set-apart spirit when John was born, concerning the promise of the deliverer. In Luke 1, 67 through 69, we read, Now his father, Zacharias, was filled with the set-apart spirit and prophesied, saying, Blessed is Yahweh Elohim of Yisrael, for he has visited and redeemed his people and has raised up a horn of salvation for us to the house of his servant David. So all of these conceptual metaphors help us created beings to understand the character, nature, function, and purpose of our Creator within the framework of creation. We know that the Messiah came fulfilling many roles in the covenant, and therefore various metaphors were used to describe him. And just to name a few, the Messiah is described as the Rosh Pina, the headstone, or the chief cornerstone. He's the head of the house, and remember the first word in the scriptures, Bereshit. The Bet is the house, and Bet Resh is house head. Those are what the characters symbolize, and Bet Resh means son. So right from the beginning, we see a message built into the Hebrew language that sets the stage for all of creation. We see that it's about a house and a house for the son. We see that in an Eastern language, but you don't get that from the English language, which just says Genesis. I mean, you're not going to get any of those messages, and that gives you a really good example of the differences between these, the languages and the different thoughts. Yeshua described himself as the door, representing the way into that house, and he called himself, the bread of life, which was meant to make us think about the manna, and he's the one who provides food for the house. And the Lamb of God was another metaphor used for him, and he's the one that covers and protects those in his house by his blood. So we see how all these metaphors actually go back to the whole concept of this creation as being a house for the Son, and how the Son actually cares for all those in the house. And these are all concrete descriptions to help us understand the role, purpose, and function of the Messiah in ways that we can easily understand. So if we want to understand our Creator and the Messiah, we need to think like Hebrews. And as I said before, Yah actually identifies himself with the East, and we read about this in Ezekiel 43, 1 through 7. It says, Afterward he brought me to the gate that faces toward the east. And behold, the esteem of the Elohim of Yisrael came from the way of the east. His voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his esteem. It was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when I came to destroy the city. The visions were like the vision which I saw by the river Chebar, and I fell on my face, and the esteem of Yahweh came into the temple by the way of the gate which faces toward the east. The Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner gate, and behold, the esteem of Yahweh filled the temple. Then I heard him speaking to me from the temple while a man stood beside me. And he said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the sons of Yisrael forever. No more shall the house of Israel defile my holy name, they nor their kings by their harlotry, or with the carcasses of their kings or on their high places. Now, consider the first part of verse 7. And I'll read it again. And he said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I shall dwell in the midst of the sons of Israel forever. Now, the phrase soles of my feet is not literal, but it's an Eastern way of referring to ownership and control. And this is what he means when he says the earth is his footstool. We read about that in Isaiah 66:1. It says, Thus says Yahweh, Heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. Where is the house that you will build me, and where is the place of my rest? Now, this is a very concrete way of showing that Yahweh rules from the heavens over the earth. Now, this is not stating that the earth is shaped like a footstool, as a platform atop of 4 large pillars. We read Yeshua actually commenting on this in Matthew 5:34 through 35. He says, But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is Elohim's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Again, this is not about the earth being a piece of furniture. It's about Elohim having absolute dominion and authority over the earth and showing the relative position of the earth in his kingdom. The footstool is at a king's throne, and it represents his dominion and authority. And we read in Psalm 110:1, Yahweh said to my Adonai, Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. This is referring to placing people at his feet. And the footstool was before the throne, and it's where submission to the sovereign took place. And we read about that in Psalm 99:5. Exalt Yahweh our Elohim and worship at his footstool. He is set apart. And Psalm 132:7. Let us go into his tabernacle, let us worship at his footstool. So the earth being a footstool of Elohim is simply showing that he has dominion and demands worship from this creation. You can't take this literally because it's not meant to be taken literally. Now, this text of Ezekiel shows how Elohim identifies himself also with direction. Remember how he refers to the east, and the east represents not only direction, but also time. As the sun rises at the dawning of the day, it marks the beginning of the light portion of a day. And just as the beginning of time began in darkness, so every day begins in the evening, and then light is brought forth in the morning. And we read in Genesis 1:14, says, Then Elohim said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and moedim, and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. Then Elohim made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. Elohim set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from darkness. And Elohim saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the 4th day. And just as the notion of direction revolves around the covenant land, so does time. Now consider the first part of Ezekiel 43:7 again. It said, And he said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne, and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the sons of Israel forever. Now notice the mention of time here. In English, we read forever. Now the Hebrew word translated as forever is olam. And now Westerners think in terms of the abstract idea of eternity or infinity when they consider this, forever or olam. This word is frequently translated as eternity or forever, but in the English language, it's misunderstood to mean a continual span of time that never ends. That's not how Easterners view that word olam. In the Hebrew mind, olam is what is at or beyond the horizon, a very distant time. It doesn't mean eternity. It simply means a long duration, antiquity, futurity, until the end of a period of time. And that period of time is determined by the context. So sometimes it's the length of a man's life, sometimes the number of generations, and until a time of renewal or to the end of an age. In fact, olam could actually be translated until the end of the age. So this is a good example of how translations from one language to another can impact the way we interpret the promises and even how we look at the future. Now let's take a specific example of how our understanding of Hebrew thought, or lack thereof, impacts our understanding of the future. We just did a teaching on the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24, and just one particular phrase in Matthew 24 is often misunderstood by people because they don't see it from a Hebrew perspective. In Matthew 24:29, we read the Messiah saying, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken." So many Westerners read that and they think, okay, all the stars are all going to fall out of the sky. We're going to have great earthquakes, and the moon's going to be darkened, and the sun's going to be darkened. These are all signs that are going to happen at the same time. Now, we saw in Genesis 1:14 that the sun and the moon are set in place for time. And what people don't realize is that this is talking about time, and the stars falling are actually, they represent powers that are being terminated, essentially. And let's just take a quick look at Genesis 37:9 to see how these heavenly bodies are actually used. In Genesis 37:9 we read, "Then he dreamed still another dream," and this is Joseph that we're talking about, "and he told it to his brothers and said, 'Look, I've dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me.'" So often the sun and the moon and the stars represent the hosts of heaven. And we have to understand that a lot of times that we're not talking about actual, heavenly signs appearing, but actually we're dealing with powers in the hosts of heaven. So we've got to understand the context of the statements, especially when they're spoken by Easterners. Remember in Deuteronomy 4:19 it says, "And take heed lest you lift your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the hosts of heaven, you feel driven to worship them and serve them, which Yahweh your Elohim has given to all the peoples under the whole earth as a heritage." Okay, so now we see Yah actually referring to these heavenly bodies as the hosts of heaven that people actually worship. And this gets even clearer when we read about Job 38, 7 through 8, about the sons of Elohim. It says, "To what were its foundations fastened, or who laid its cornerstone, when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of Elohim shouted for joy?" So you see, Job connects the sons of Elohim with the stars. And we read in Psalm 147:4, he counts the number of the stars. He calls them all by name. So these stars are named. Again, when we understand them as the sons of Elohim, it starts to make more sense. He's associating these stars with the heavenly hosts, the sons of Elohim. And remember again in Deuteronomy 32:8, when he said, "The Most High divided their inheritance to the nations. When he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Elohim." So now we see after Babel, again, the sons of Elohim were set up over the nations, and the nations ended up worshiping them, and the sons of Elohim were connected with the heavenly hosts. Now, with that understanding, that the sun and the moon and the stars are linked with the hosts of heaven and the sons of Elohim that rule over the earth, as well as time, we can begin to understand that the words of Yeshua are not necessarily referring to an actual physical sign, but rather an overthrowing of powers, okay? And we look at that we see an example of that in Isaiah 14:12-13, when he's talking about a falling star as a loss of position. And it says, a lot of people think this refers to Lucifer, but the actual word for Lucifer is Hillel in Hebrew. Lucifer is just a made-up word from the Latin. We read in Isaiah 14:12-13, "How you are fallen from heaven, O Hillel, son of the morning, how you are cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nations. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of Elohim. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north." Now consider as Isaiah prophesies about the downfall of Babylon at 13:9-10. It says, "Behold, the day of Yahweh comes, cruel, with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he will destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. Boy, it sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? This describes judgment that came against Babylon, and it's called the Day of Yahuwah. Many people think that the Day of the Lord or the Day of Yahuwah is just one single event that takes place in the future, but that's not accurate. The Day of Yahuwah is simply a day of judgment when he judges a kingdom or a people. Now consider how Ezekiel describes the punishment concerning Pharaoh in Egypt. In Ezekiel 32:7, it says, "When I put out your light, I will cover the heavens and make its stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give its light." Now again, we see very similar language. And again, this is a Hebrew way, an Eastern way of describing the end of a kingdom, a nation, or a ruler. And this all means the downfall of a nation, not actual stars falling out of the sky, and not necessarily even the physical signs that we think of when we think of the sun becoming dark and the moon not giving its light. Now, back to Matthew 24:9 again. It says, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken." Well, there it says right at the end, the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. So that's the context of what's going on. And we can see that the stars are the powers of the heavens, the sons of Elohim. This is all that's happening. So in my two-part teaching from Jerusalem on understanding Matthew 24, we go into the whole verse in depth, but just this one section is important to understand that Yeshua was using Hebrew language to announce the end of a kingdom and the end of the powers and the reign that they have over the world. He came and he was going to basically reset and take over the planet and establish the kingdom here on earth. So it would be lights out, essentially, for the kingdom of Judah after the tribulation of those days, which was the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. That was the context. He was saying basically it's all over at that point. So understanding that the stars represent powers makes much more sense in Revelation 2:1, Revelation 3:1, but they also can represent real heavenly bodies and constellations, as we read about in Revelation 12:4. We can actually see how these things manifest through the constellations. Revelation 12:4 talks about his tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. So we see a combination of signs in the sky as well as things actually happening in the spirit realm, the powers of heaven. And this is why there was a star to announce the coming of the Messiah, the only begotten Son of Elohim. A star was a sign for Yeshua. In Numbers 24:17 we read, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come from Yaakov. A scepter shall rise out of Israel, and batter the brow of Moab, and destroy all the sons of tumult." Now in Daniel 8:8-11, we read also another description of a star. "Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground, and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down." So again, we see this language regarding stars, and it's involving the host of heaven. And when you put it in context, it makes a lot more sense. So I hope this provides some helpful guidance for those who are seeking truth. Hebrew thought impacts the way we perceive the creation and the Creator. It impacts how we understand time and the restoration of time through the covenant. And this distinction between abstract and concrete carries over to the way we think and understand the scriptures and the faith described in the scriptures. So the path of leaving Babylon and entering into the covenant with Yahweh is the path of a Hebrew. And if we want to know the covenant and walk in the covenant, then we need to learn to think and live like Hebrews. And that often involves a multi-dimensional parallel shift in the way we think and perceive the world around us. So we'll talk about this more in our next episode when we take a further and more in-depth look into the Hebrew language. Until then, my name is Todd Bennett. Shalom.